Okay, so what I'm going to talk about this morning is a putative formula for success. Now, I say putative because that implies that I somehow know what it means to be successful, and I don't. I've got my theories and ideas, but I am not naive, stupid, or arrogant enough to think that I'm somehow some model of success and that I know exactly what to do. What I'm really encouraging you to do is to think about how you would define success for yourself. How would you feel happy in your future and contented? And how can we understand some of those concepts? Because they're actually really complicated and difficult. So, I mean, starting off with aspiration, what does aspiration mean? This is a term that I've really struggled to pin down. I think it's a metaphor because if you talk about aspiration, technically speaking, it means to blow out air. And it comes from a Latin root meaning that, just exhale, effectively. So why does this have a connection with desire or aiming or ambition? That part of the story is really quite unclear to me. It seems there's some sort of poetic origins. Some poets like Alexander Pope and William Shakespeare used the verb aspire to mean not just to expel air, but to seek out something with a degree of ardent desire. So it's a really interesting turn of phrase, but it has certain potentially toxic connotations. For example, I'm a little bit disturbed by the notion of upward mobility, because that sort of suggests that there are some who are higher and some who are lower. And if you are mobile, then you're sort of gravitating up the hill away from being downward. I think for a start, the physics of that geometry is complicated and a bit confusing. But I also don't quite see why being mobile makes you somehow better or upward. So I'm a little bit concerned by that. I mean, just to give you a concrete example, when I visited schools in parts of Wales that are quite badly impoverished, I would always get this sort of weird sense in my gut that I was saying to them tacitly or even maybe explicitly that if they moved out of Wales and they came to England and came to Oxford, that would somehow improve them. But I realized that was just plain wrong. And it was also incredibly toxic to sort of say, this environment you're in here is not as good as the one that I come from. So I hate that notion of aspiration, this sort of sense of haughty arrogance. And it's quite often associated with Oxford University. A lot of people sort of look at Oxford University and they think, well, this is a place that sort of is all very la-di-da. It's very proud of itself. People are sort of strutting around thinking they're the bee's knees. I mean, actually, in my experience of working at Oxford, that's not the case. The vast majority of people that work in Oxford are very humble. And they are humble because they don't necessarily feel that they entirely belong in Oxford. They have what's called imposter syndrome. But I still just want to be absolutely clear that I don't think that aspiring to Oxford means that you have to denigrate your current circumstances, or you have to sort of say that your family or your parents are worse than you or have not done as well. I think you need to have a much more sophisticated and complex notion of success and attainment that doesn't destroy elements of your own past and doesn't make you feel like what came before was somehow a failure, because then I think it'll just make you somewhat resentful and maybe even hate this notion of success. So you need to think about success in a very relativistic sense. In other words, success is not absolute. Going to a university like Oxford does not automatically make you a success. Earning lots of money does not automatically make you a success. Becoming very powerful does not automatically make you a success. And leaving your family and friends and moving to a different context and a different place obviously doesn't mean that you have somehow made yourself better automatically. Success is relative to each person, to each time, to each aspiration, to what one individual wants to give to the world, what they want to exhale into the world. So I think you need to be very careful in how you assess a notion like success. But I think now is the time to start thinking about it and how you might try and adapt to it. So let's have a little bit of a think about what sort of formulae for success we could potentially come up with. Now, we should probably start with a few baseline descriptions. First of all, what even is a formula? Well, obviously, I'm not going to try and patronize you, but something akin to a recipe that gives you the inputs and ascribes a certain output. It's a copula between the input and output. And so very famous one here, speed equals distance over time. But the reason that I love formulae is that they are precise, They're parsimonious. In other words, they don't have a huge amount of detail, but they can help us understand an extraordinary amount about the universe and the world. And so if we could similarly simplify our aspirations into some sort of neat formulae, that could be potentially incredibly powerful. And so that's what I would like you to have a think about over the next hour or so. So let's look at some of the implications of this formula, speed equals distance divided by time, which is super cool, right? Now, I'm not a physicist, but all of this sort of stuff just blows my mind. The amount of power we can take from a formula is as elegant as speed equals distance over time is quite astounding. So, for example, why don't we ask ourselves some straightforward questions? How fast are you moving at this very moment? Do you think you're going anywhere at all? Well, I mean, those of you who are already sort of studying physics probably know some of these answers already. We know, for example, that from the spin of the Earth alone, you're traveling at about 650 miles an hour right now, just as the Earth spins. And that makes sense, right? Because the center of the Earth is about 40,000 kilometers round at the equator at its fattest point. And it has to make that 40,000 kilometer journey within a 24-hour time frame. So if we do speed equals distance over time, we can work out the speed. Now, of course, the speed is going to vary where on the Earth's surface you are. It's going to be moving fastest at the equator and slowest at the poles because it's only moving a relatively small amount over a 24-hour time period there. But nonetheless, we're moving really freaking fast. And even though you don't feel it, we really are. And then we can go even further than that because, of course, the Earth is also moving around the sun. It's moving in an elliptical orbit. And again, we know some of the parameters of this. We know roughly the size of that ellipsis, and we know the time it takes. It takes approximately 365 days to make that journey. And so then we can work out that we're moving at about 67,000 miles an hour around the sun. And we're also barreling our way towards the constellation of Leo because the entire of our solar system is moving itself. And that is at about 872,406 miles an hour. So you're moving really, really fast. I mean, if all of that momentum suddenly stopped, you'd know about it, right? Because that would be a bit like being in a train traveling nearly 900,000 miles an hour that suddenly comes to a halt. You're going to go flying. And that's what would happen if the Earth ever decided to stop moving. But anyway, the point is that from a formula, you can come up with some extremely elegant and powerful insights about the world. And that's why I think it's quite a good idea to try and stylize your own formula for success. But it absolutely must be stressed that this is your own formula for success. You have to own it. You can't allow someone to just say that there are some trinkets of life that you can take that will make you an instant success, because that gets back to my misgivings earlier about this sort of notion that there are some people who are better and some people who are worse. And I think that sort of language of better and worse is toxic and unhelpful and tends to undermine the various difficulties that would have been confronted by certain people at certain times. Just before we move on, there's all sorts of more super cool things about speed and time that I've just discovered, and therefore I want to share because they're just fun. You probably all know the universal speed limit is the speed of light, which is specifically 186,000 miles per second, or about 671 million miles an hour. Now, I need to wear tinted glasses because I'm half blind, so bear with me if I crane in a little bit to read some of these figures. One astronomical unit is the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and that is approximately 93 million miles. So how long does it take for the light from the Sun to reach us here on Earth? Well, time equals distance divided by speed. The distance is 93 million miles, and it's traveling at about 186 million miles per second, meaning that the light takes about 499 seconds, or approximately 8 minutes, to get from the sun to us here on Earth. Now, that means that if the sun suddenly snuffed out, it would take us 8 minutes to realize, and then we'd probably all die pretty quickly. And there's another super cool implication of this, which is that you can see back in time at night. The closest galaxy to our own, the Milky Way, is the Andromeda galaxy, and we can see stars from that galaxy. Now, those stars are at the minimum 2.5 million light years away, meaning that when you're looking at the twinkling of those stars, that twinkling started its journey 2.5 million years ago, which is before there were any human beings on Earth. So those photons of light left the Andromeda galaxy before there was humanity at all, and it finished its journey on your retinas. How cool is that? So you're basically looking back in time. I'm sorry, I'm so much of a geek about these things, but I just find them incredibly powerful. So let's get on to success a little bit more clearly. What is success? How can we define success? Well, as I've mentioned, a dictionary definition of success isn't particularly empowering because I think there's a really important relativistic component to success. In other words, someone's success is relative to their aims, and the context within which they find themselves. You can't really, I don't think, come up with particularly clear-sighted, universal notions of successfulness. There are a few options that people do tend to talk about over and over again. For example, money. It's often equated that success equals earning money. And for some people, that will be what they seek because money is a tool that helps you liberate yourself. In other words, money gives you choices and it gives you a range of choices. And that's what lots of people want. They want that liberation, and that's fine. If I say success is relative, then who am I to say that earning money is not therefore a potential marker for success? But I don't think it counts as a universal metric. And therefore, I don't look at people who are richer than me and think that they are necessarily a better version of themselves than they could be. So I don't think that money is necessarily the whole deal. Because one of the key elements about earning money is, well, how much would ever be enough? And it's a similar question with power. Let's say that you think rather than just earning money, you want to have power, you want to have responsibility, you want to have authority. That is another thing that lots of people look to as a marker of success. But would that necessarily make you feel the most yourself? Would that necessarily bring you alive and into yourself? Maybe. Some people want power for various reasons. Good for them, but not for everyone. So hopefully what you can see I'm getting at is being a bit kinder to yourself, being a bit clearer as to what you aspire to, not what someone else aspires from you, but what you would like to achieve in your life. Okay. Maybe the best thing to think about is how you can be the best version of yourself possible. I think that's possibly going to be the most useful thing to think about. If you don't mind just turning your microphones off, that would be great. Thanks. So yeah, let's get back to it. So let's have a look. So first of all, money. Let's start with money, right? This is the richest man on earth, Jeff Bezos. He's the founder and CEO of the Amazon online shopping company. His wealth is roughly $128 billion, although it's a mixture of liquid and illiquid assets, so it's hard to calculate precisely, but it's a lot of money, right? Now, what a lot of people sort of suggest is that, well, to be successful, you need to earn money. But then, like I was mentioning earlier, how much money is enough to allow you to be satisfactorily consider yourself a success? I mean, let's take a fairly arbitrary figure. Let's take £1 million. What if you earned £1 million? Would that make you successful? Well, sure, if that's what you aspire to. But it's not an unambiguous mark of success to my mind, because you're still miles away from this guy. Right? If you earned £1 million and you decided to count your money £1 a second, it would take you about 11 and a half days to count your wealth. Okay. If he was to try and count his wealth in the same methodology, $1 per second, it would take him about 4,000 years, because 128 billion is a much bigger number than 1 million. And what I'm talking about here is just the scale of distance between relative wealth is just extraordinary, such that it's very difficult to say at what point an amount of money would render you a success. Do you just need to be above the average wage? But then why would someone who's earning less than average be somehow less successful? It doesn't seem that obvious to me that money is a terribly good metric. And even if you think that Jeff Bezos is the most successful human on the planet so far, his wealth absolutely pales in comparison to this guy. This is Mansa Musa. He was the leader of the Malian Empire in West Africa in the 1300s, the early 1300s, and his wealth by modern standards is estimated at about $500 billion. So, money is just such a crass, blunt mechanism for assessing someone's worth as an individual, someone's success. It may well be something that you aspire to. And as I say, it's far be it from me to denigrate that ambition. But all I'm trying to get at is this notion that it needs to be slightly clearer as to what you intend the money to achieve. Money is just a mechanism. It's a medium of exchange. It's not an evaluator in and of itself. So what really matters is what I think you are seeking to do for yourself. with that money, rather than just the acquisition of wealth in and of itself. And then we could look to power. Well, would power be a good metric of success? Well, again, possibly, and people could quite legitimately seek it. But it's not necessarily clear, again, what that power would help you achieve. This is the world's most powerful man. It doesn't appear to make him terribly satisfied or happy. He seems to be constantly unhappy and stressed, if his Twitter feed is anything to go by. So this notion that power somehow makes you the most you can possibly be, makes you the best version of yourself possible, is again highly dubious and ambiguous. And obviously, power is a function of how well you work with others to obtain that power, because power in human societies tends to be a function of your cooperation. So an individual is never really that powerful on their own. Even autocrats rely on a huge network of supporters in order to execute their autocratic rule. So power, again, is not necessarily an individual marker of success. All right? I'm not necessarily providing any clear answers here. I just genuinely want you to think very clearly about what you think would make for the most successful version of you. So let's talk about being the best version of you and what sort of psychological research there is that pertains to this question. This is a very famous diagram. It's called Maslow's Hierarchy of Need, and it comes from a man called Abraham Maslow. Many of you will probably have come across this before, but if you haven't, it's not a problem. It's pretty intuitive, but it's also very elegant and very powerful. The base of the pyramid are our most basic needs, those needs that we have in order to just continuing to exist. So, air, water, food, shelter, physiological necessity. If we want to continue living to tomorrow and the next week and the week after that, we have to obtain that very basic level of need. And then as we move up the chain, up the pyramid to the top, we're starting to deal with needs that are not necessary in terms of our continued existence, but necessary in an evolutionary biology sense. In other words, this is what psychologists and evolutionary biologists suggest tends to bring us as human beings the greatest happiness. Now, of course, this is a generalization. So it will not be the case that every single human being can apply the same formula and get the same result. There will be some that are outlying a general trend. But nonetheless, it's a general trend with a pretty tight degree of variance, that most human beings, whether they're willing to acknowledge it or not, are seeking ultimately some degree of self-actualization, meaning trying to be, desiring to be the purest, most advanced version of themselves that they're able to be. In other words, building on their existing talents, not trying to be somebody else, not trying to be the best version of an archetype that they are not trying to be the richest person because someone else is rich, not trying to be the most powerful person because someone else has power, but trying to be the best version of them that they can possibly be. Okay? And working this out requires a degree of self-assessment, honesty, and maturity, which is extremely difficult to obtain. And like I said, I don't think I've fully done the homework myself. And I'm often sort of berating myself for not earning more, not being more powerful, not having made more career steps at a certain age and all of these sorts of things. But I think it's just healthy to stop every now and then and sort of think, well, have you spent this day being the best version of yourself you can be? And if you can say that, then that's been a good day. It's been a successful day. And try not to be so hard on yourself and sort of setting goals which are maybe unobtainable, because they're not realistic assessments of what you're best at, would be my point, I suppose. So what's my formula for success? Well, here it is. This is very much my formula, so do bear with me. If you don't agree with me, then good, frankly. I want you to work it out for yourself. And it looks a little bit sort of weird and mathsy, but I'll explain it. It's actually fairly straightforward. So the formula is that self-actualization, so being the most of yourself that it's possible to be, is equal to the sum of sustained energy. So energy that you commit to improving yourself over a sustained period of time. It's not enough to be energetic every now and then. You need to sustain that energy. This is a concept described as delayed gratification. And one of the best predictors of successful people in this world are those that can delay their gratification, those that can hold off a reward until a later date, because they are having to build up a store of skills, knowledge, and connections in order to obtain a higher order goal. And that delayed gratification is fundamentally important. That's why we teach it to very young children as far as possible. Obviously, sometimes, having an immediate return on a desire is fairly normal and reasonable. But certain higher order desires require just endless commitment and focus over quite a sustained period of time. And that could mean having a few days, weeks, or months where you're not necessarily enjoying what you're doing, but you're working solidly towards a particular goal. Now, I see this a lot with my undergraduate students. They have a 3-year course. They're not going to be loving every single day of that course, but they know that the commitment of 3 years is going to be worth it in the end, because they'll have a skill set that will make them highly marketable and will also help them see the world in a more sophisticated way than they might otherwise have been capable of. So that sustained energy, to my mind, is one of the most fundamental factors. But I then multiply this by the square of cooperation, because I think cooperation with other people is so important that it has an order of magnitude that is exponential. Now, of course, this is just not real mathematics. I'm not saying that it's literally multiplied by the square of cooperation, but I think if you can sort of bear with me some sort of sloppy geometry, the effort that we put in is also having to be squared with the networks of people that we work with. Human beings are a fundamentally social species. When you're born, you are almost entirely defenseless, and you have to rely on the support of others in order to survive. And every stage of our life is similarly embedded in networks of individuals, whether we realize it or not. Some people might like to think of themselves as extremely successful entirely on their own merits, but that is almost always complete nonsense. You can't, for example, establish a world-leading business without a huge number of partners and consumers and regulators who can create the right environment for that business, and so on and so on and so on. The idea that one person has the sufficient genius to achieve all of this on their own, I'm afraid, is completely incredulous. I cannot believe it, because it's just so obviously not true. So this notion, this sort of solipsistic notion that individual genius shapes the world, is a sort of arrogant paradigm which I see a lot at the moment, but I keep thinking is just nonsense. Now, again, that is my perspective, and everything in academia is up for debate. So for goodness sake, do feel free to disagree with me. Very happy to hear some different views. This is just my case. You think of your own case. Okay. Now, the sum of your sustained energy multiplied by cooperation squared is divided by the sum of your troubles and your fears. Okay. So those are the bits that you can't fully control, and that they can diminish your capacity to self-actualize. And therefore, sometimes you won't be able to be the best version of yourself it's possible to be, because you can't always control those exogenous forces. So what are some of those forces that you can't necessarily control? Well, we'll talk about them a bit later. Let's talk first of all about your energy potential. Now, this allows us to indulge ourselves in a little bit more sort of formulaic thinking, this time courtesy of this wonderful man, Albert Einstein, and his most famous contribution to science, arguably, in his work on special relativity. I think it's special relativity. E, or energy, is equal to mc squared, or mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. Okay, so energy, these are all in sort of SI units. Energy in joules is equal to mass in kilograms multiplied by the speed of light squared. So the energy in joules, let's say that you're the average adult in the UK. The average adult in the UK weighs approximately 80 kilos. So that means that the energy potential of an individual adult, now by energy potential, I'm talking about if you split all the atoms in an adult, which would be desperately unethical. So we're not going to do this, but it's still pretty cool to work it out, right? 80 kilos multiplied by the speed of light squared, which is 300 million meters per second squared. So that means that an average UK adult has the joules energy potential of about 7.2 septillion joules, which is just mind-bendingly huge number. And 7.2 septillion joules is equivalent to about 1.7 billion tons of TNT. So an extraordinary amount of dynamite is contained in the fizzing adult British person. Just to give you some further sort of reference point, 1.7 billion tons of TNT is about 86,000 nuclear bombs. So an individual adult has about that much energy potential inside of them. Now, of course, this is all slightly sort of flippant physics. You can't go about splitting the atoms of human beings and extracting that energy. And if you could, it would be illegal, I hope. But the point is that it's a cool bit of maths, I guess. And also to just sort of emphasize that you probably have a lot more energy than you realize. The energy that we have, our capacity to do sustained effort, is almost entirely a function of our discipline and of our minds. It therefore depends on what you're willing to do rather than what you feel you're capable of doing, because your body will always give back to you if you push yourself a little bit harder. Now, obviously, there will be certain limits to what you're capable of. Eventually, utter exhaustion is likely to set in. And if you ever push yourself that far, then it can become dangerous. But at the same time, most people aren't pushing themselves as hard as they could do. They're not doing as much as they could do to improve themselves and to make themselves the best version of themselves that it's possible to be. So maybe just identify those times in your day and those times in your life when you're thinking, I can't be bothered. And try and see if you can make that more productive, make that more constructive so that you can make yourself more powerful. This is not so that you can develop power in and of itself, but so that you can be the more powered up version of yourself and therefore be, to my mind, more successful. But of course, we've got to recognize there are certain things that cannot be controlled, that you can't do anything about. And perhaps the most obvious is time, which yields another sort of beautiful and elegant bit of physics, which is this. This is the formula for the second law of thermodynamics, which is that entropy in an isolated system can only increase. Entropy is a sort of metric of disorder, and disorderedness in energy is what describes the arrow of time. So the reason that time only goes in one direction and we can't just sort of stop it or make it go backwards is because of this. It's because from the Big Bang up to whatever the end of the universe will look like, energy is disordering. It's becoming more sort of fragmented. And so that's why time is always flowing in one direction. You can't do anything about it. So time is one variable that we can't control. Obviously, we can control what we do with our own time, but we can't actually manipulate space-time ourselves yet, although we'll see. The other thing you can't do is the troubles that might beset you. So there can be various things that could potentially hold you back. There could be sort of relationship issues. There could be health issues. There could be any number of things. It doesn't do to beat yourself up about such things, because if there's nothing you can do about it, then blaming yourself is not going to help you be the best version of yourself. And you always need to assess the best version of yourself relative to what your context provides. So these troubles can come in a range of forms. I'm half blind, and for a lot of my life, I used to sort of blame myself for that. And then I realized with maturity that it's very daft to sort of assess my capacity relative to a disability when I had no control over that. So I think this is very easy from my perspective to say to someone who's much younger, half my age, to say to you all, you shouldn't blame yourself, you should be better. But I know that a lot of young people do tend to be quite hard on themselves. But it doesn't necessarily help a great deal. Okay, let's talk about cooperation. So I mentioned in my formula that cooperation is an extremely important component. Indeed, that success is a product of your energy commitment plus energy commitment and cooperation squared. And I think asking for help is absolutely essential. And there are various ethical rules which philosophers talk about, which can maximize the amount of cooperation you're likely to receive. Now, of course, this is a generalization. It's not going to be entirely true. One is called the golden rule and the other is called the silver rule. The golden rule you probably heard as do unto others as you would have done to yourself. The silver rule is just the reverse of that. Don't do to others what you would not like done to yourself. Now, these rules are most often associated with the Old and New Testaments. So in the Old Testament, Leviticus states, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your kinsfolk. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, it says, "Do to others what you would want them to do to you. This is the meaning of the law of Moses and the teaching of the prophets." Now, there's nothing uniquely Christian or Jewish about these ethical proclamations. They've been discovered in far older religious texts in parts of Tamil Nadu in India. They've been found, of course, Quran. They've been found in the works of Chinese philosophers and Japanese. It's basically a universal concept. And it's so intuitive that as a species, we cannot survive without cooperation. And therefore, treating other people worse is self-defeating for most of us. It will only end up with you diminishing yourself if you try to do in other people. Now, there are still some people that thrive on demeaning and diminishing others. There is a proportion of the population which have some degree of psychopathy, that they don't feel emotion, they can't empathize, and they feel that they enhance themselves by diminishing other people. It's very difficult to do anything about someone like that, except to just try and find those that help you be the better version of yourself that it's possible to be, and to accept that those that do diminish and undermine others tend to have their comeuppance sooner or later. It's not a particularly sustainable model of success to constantly denigrate other people. And I dare say that the current incumbent of the White House is going to find that out to his cost fairly shortly. Okay, so troubles that you can control. Well, there are certain... Again, I don't want to make this sort of excessively biblical. In fact, this is not in the Bible, but the so-called 7 deadly sins are not biblical, but they were outlined by a pope in the 6th century AD. And these are sort of basically assessments of behavior where you constantly try and outdo somebody else, that you render success as a function of competition rather than self-actualization. In other words, my success has to be at someone else's cost. And I think that leads to more trouble than success. And I think, therefore, you can control it. So, for example, greed and envy is where you're not thinking about how you can be the best version of yourself. You're thinking about how you can be as good as someone else's version of success, or how you can diminish them in order to dominate them. Anger and pride come from a similar stable of emotion as those. And then sloth is just laziness, where you're not sustaining your energy and you're not allowing yourself to be the best version of yourself that it's possible to be. Now, of course, all of these and various other so-called sins are very, very common. And of course, I am as guilty of these as anyone else on a daily basis. And, the human brain is such a complicated organ that we will often have these emotions simultaneous to each other. In other words, we'll have a pull of one part of our brain saying, right, I must go and do some more work and do something productive. And another part of our brain, which is just sort of saying, oh, screw it. I just want to go and lie down. And, this sort of pull is a feature of our evolutionary biology, that we have what some people describe as a lizard brain or a sort of primate brain, which tends to focus around the emotional centers of our brains, and a human brain, which is the bit on the outer cerebral cortex that is completely sui generis to human beings. And so we get these sort of various intellectual neurological pulls. The basic point is that, again, there's no point being hard on yourself if you feel these emotions, to anger, to greed, to pride, to laziness. That's normal, but you can subvert those. You can train yourself to work around them, to not allow yourself to just give in and yield to anger, to pride, to sloth. Because if you focus on how you can be the best version of yourself, then it doesn't much matter whether or not your best friend is earning more than you, or your partner has more power than you. Because provided you're confident in yourself, you're sure that you are aspiring to being the best version of you it's possible to be, then it really doesn't matter. And you won't feel those emotions quite so much. Okay. But again, easy to say, very difficult to do. So what should you do now? Well, ask yourself a deceptively simple question. And I suggest you do that in the next few minutes before I start the next session at 12:15. How can I make the world a little bit better than I found it? I think that this, for many people, and again, this is a generalization, it's not going to apply to everyone, but I think for many people, this is the fundamental question that gives their life some meaning. How can I make it better than I found it? Now, the default is that you've already made the world better just by existing. So, well done. Doing no wrong makes the world a better place without you having to actually mix any of your energy with the resources around you. But I'm sure you're capable of taking that a step further, of powering yourself up to another level whereby that you can make the world around you even more wonderful and beautiful. And this, as I say, is ancient philosophy. There is nothing new about this in the slightest. But those ancient that ancient wisdom has a lot that can tell us about how to live today that I think is empowering, especially when we start talking in the language of aspiration and career development and success. So have a think about that. Work out your own formula. But as you do so, I think some fundamental tools to remember: respect yourself, be true to yourself, be honest, work out what you really want out of life. Don't work out what someone else wants for you or what someone else wants for life that you want to copy. Work out what you would like from life. Work with others, because that's basically essential. For your childhood, it was completely essential, but we tend to start to think that we have to work it out on our own from now on, but that's not true. Aspire to be the best version of yourself it's possible to be. And no one can really ask any more than that, can they? Without being unreasonable. And if you do that, you'll definitely, you'll make the world more beautiful than you found it. And what could be better than that? Okay, so there we go. That's what you've got to do over the next 20 minutes-ish. And then at 12:15, I'll be talking a bit about how to think more like an Oxford student. So I look forward to speaking to you then. Obviously, if you have any questions, do feel free to add them to the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on that. So in fact, I'm going to have a look at it now just to see if anyone submitted anything. Oh yeah, we have. Oh, it's all right. I'll deal with those questions later. They're more sort of technical questions. Okay, Grant. I hope everything's going well. Obviously, keep in touch. Send me some emails if you're having any difficulties. But yeah, I'll see you all at 12:15. Grant, thanks everyone. Diolch.